His hand was already around her throat when the footsteps stopped behind them. The men laughed until the air in the hallway changed, and a calm voice said, "Take your hands off my wife." That's when they realized the waitress they cornered belonged to the man who owns this city's shadows, and he hadn't come to talk. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. No one at El Rosario ever talked about Carolina, not because she wasn't noticed, but because she blended too well into the background. Her name was Carolina Rojas, a woman whose quiet presence made her forgettable by design. Anyone looking at her saw only a tired waitress who kept her head down and never made eye contact longer than necessary. She moved through tables like a ghost, wiping spills, taking orders in a worn apron, speaking just loud enough to be heard over the kitchen noise. But what none of the customers crowding the cramped restaurant knew, what even her co-workers had never imagined, was that Carolina Rojas was the wife of Mark Rojas, one of the most feared and disciplined mafia bosses in the entire city. Her past was sealed behind years of careful distance, her connection to power buried beneath double shifts and grease-stained uniforms. Her survival had depended on becoming invisible after a car bomb meant for Mark had nearly ripped her life apart. The regulars assumed she was just another immigrant working minimum wage to survive. Nobody imagined she had once stood beside a man whose name alone could empty rooms. Nobody imagined she had walked away from luxury, protection, and bloodshed to scrub floors in a place that smelled of oil and bleach. Nobody imagined she had chosen poverty over becoming leverage in a war she wanted no part of. And most importantly, no one imagined that touching her would be the last mistake they'd ever make. That mistake was about to cost them everything. El Rosario wasn't the kind of restaurant people chose, it was the kind they settled for. Cracked vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects, a narrow back hallway that reeked of fryer oil and industrial bleach. The kind of place where the menu was laminated and sticky, and the coffee tasted like it had been sitting since morning. Carolina had been working there for 3 years. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of perfecting invisibility. 3 years of pretending the past didn't follow her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She wiped down table 6 with mechanical precision, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a few loose strands framing her face. Her apron was stained from the dinner rush salsa, grease, something unidentifiable near the pocket. Her hands moved efficiently, clearing plates, stacking glasses, resetting silverware wrapped in paper napkins. She never looked at the customers unless absolutely necessary. Eye contact invited conversation. Conversation invited questions. Questions invited memories she had buried 3 years ago when she walked away from the only man she had ever loved. "Carolina, table 9 needs water," Miguel called from behind the counter. He was the owner's nephew, 17, always on his phone, perpetually annoyed by the existence of work. She nodded without speaking and filled a plastic pitcher from the industrial sink in the back. The water was lukewarm. The ice machine had been broken for 2 weeks. No one had called a repairman because no one had the money. Carolina didn't complain. Complaining drew attention. She carried the pitcher through the narrow aisle between booths, navigating the obstacle course of chair legs and outstretched feet with practiced ease. A couple at table 9 barely acknowledged her as she refilled their glasses. The man was scrolling through his phone. The woman was picking at her enchiladas like they had personally offended her. Carolina returned to the kitchen, set the pitcher down, and exhaled slowly. This was her life now. Routine, predictable, safe. But safety, she had learned, was an illusion that shattered the moment you believed in it. She first noticed them during the 6 o'clock rush. 3 men seated in booth 7 near the back, laughing too loudly, taking up too much space. The kind of men who treated public spaces like personal territory, who expected the world to adjust around them rather than the other way around. Carolina had seen their type before. She had lived with their type before. The one in the middle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie despite the heat, was clearly the leader. He sat with his back to the wall, legs spread wide, one arm draped across the torn vinyl like he owned the booth. His face carried the kind of smug confidence that came from never being told no. To his left sat a smaller man in a blue polo shirt, constantly grinning, his eyes scanning the restaurant like he was looking for something to laugh at. He had the energy of someone who needed an audience to exist. The third was younger, maybe early 20s, sitting slightly apart from the other 2 like he wasn't sure he belonged. He kept glancing at the leader for approval, mirroring his gestures half a second too late. Carolina kept her distance. She assigned their table to Jessica, the other waitress on shift, a single mother of two who needed the tips more than Carolina did. But even from across the restaurant, Carolina could feel their eyes following her, watching, measuring. She moved between tables with deliberate casualness, never looking directly at booth 7 but always aware of their presence, the way predators were aware of prey, the way prey were aware of predators. "Hey, sweetheart," the voice came from behind her as she cleared table 4. Carolina's hands didn't stop moving. She stacked plates with the same mechanical efficiency, her face betraying nothing. "You deaf or something?" The voice was closer now. Amused, testing boundaries, she turned slowly, balancing the stack of dirty dishes against her hip. The man in the blue polo shirt stood 3 feet away, grinning like they were old friends. Up close, she could see the way his eyes moved quick, predatory, cataloging her body like merchandise. "Table 7 needs more salsa," he said, even though Jessica had just refilled their bowl 2 minutes ago. Carolina nodded once and moved past him toward the kitchen. His hand shot out and caught her wrist. Not hard, not painful. Just enough to stop her. Just enough to establish control. "I'm talking to you," he said quietly, still smiling. Carolina looked down at his hand wrapped around her wrist, then up at his face. Her expression remained perfectly neutral. No fear, no anger, no reaction at all. She had learned long ago that reactions fed men like this. "Let go," she said evenly. He laughed and released her, holding both hands up in mock surrender. "Relax, I'm just being friendly." Carolina walked away without responding. Behind her, she heard him return to booth 7, heard the low rumble of male laughter, heard one of them say something in Spanish she didn't catch. She set the dishes in the industrial sink and gripped the edge of the counter, breathing slowly through her nose. 3 years, she thought. 3 years of staying invisible. And now 3 men who thought silence meant weakness. Carolina straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and returned to the floor. The restaurant hummed with its usual chaos, dishes clattering, conversations overlapping, the perpetual sizzle of the grill. But something had shifted. In booth 7, 3 men watched her move between tables. And Carolina Rojas, invisible by design, forgotten by choice, felt the careful architecture of her new life begin to crack. Carolina had learned invisibility the hard way. Years earlier, her name had meant something dangerous. She had once stood beside Mark Rojas, when his rise through the criminal underworld was written in blood and loyalty, when their apartment overlooked the city like a throne room, when men with guns stood outside her door not to threaten but to protect. She had seen what power demanded, and she had seen what it cost. The memory hit her as she refilled coffee cups at table 12, unexpected, visceral, pulling her backward through time like a riptide she couldn't fight. 7 years ago. The penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered like broken glass. Carolina had been 23 then, young enough to believe love could exist separately from violence. Mark had been 28, already building an empire from the ruins of the previous generation's mistakes. He wasn't like the men who had come before him, loud, reckless, drunk on their own mythology. Mark was calculated, disciplined. He spoke softly. And people listened because the alternative was unthinkable. She had met him at her cousin's wedding. He'd worn a black suit that fit like it had been tailored to his skeleton, and when he'd asked her to dance, she'd said yes without knowing his last name. By the end of the night, she knew everything, and somehow, impossibly, she had stayed. "Carolina?" Miguel's voice snapped her back to the present. "You okay? You've been standing there for like a minute." She blinked and realized the coffee pot in her hand was empty, had been empty, and she'd been holding it over an already full cup. "I'm fine," she said automatically. But she wasn't fine. The memories were flooding back now, breaking through the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her past. Mark had never raised his voice to her. Not once. Not when she questioned his decisions. Not when she demanded answers he couldn't give. Not even when she threw a glass against the wall during their worst fight and it shattered 2 inches from his head. He had simply looked at the broken glass, then at her, and said, "Feel better?" "No," she'd whispered. "Then talk to me." That was the thing about Mark Rojas that no one outside their home understood. The man who could dismantle a rival's operation with surgical precision, who inspired loyalty through respect rather than fear, who had built a criminal empire before he turned 30. That man came home and asked about her day, made her coffee exactly how she liked it, remembered her mother's birthday when Carolina herself forgot. Violence was his profession, but it had never been his nature. Carolina moved through her shift on autopilot, her body performing tasks while her mind remained trapped in the past. She wiped tables that were already clean, refilled water glasses that were still half full, avoided booth 7 with an instinct that ran deeper than conscious thought. The 3 men were still there, ordering more food they didn't eat, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, watching her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. She had felt that attention before, from men who looked at her and saw leverage, an opening, a weakness in Mark's otherwise impenetrable armor. The night everything shattered had started ordinarily enough. Mark had left early for a meeting he couldn't discuss. Carolina had stayed home, reading on the balcony, wrapped in one of his shirts that smelled like cedar and smoke. She'd been safe, protected, surrounded by men whose entire job was keeping her alive. She hadn't heard the car alarm, hadn't noticed the black sedan parked 3 spots away from Mark's usual space in the underground garage, hadn't seen the timer counting down beneath the driver's seat. Mark had called her from the elevator. "I'm 2 minutes away. Want me to pick up dinner?" "Thai food," she'd said. "Extra spring rolls. Always extra spring rolls," he'd laughed. Those were the last normal words they'd ever spoken to each other. The explosion had shattered every window on the ground floor. The shockwave had knocked Carolina off her feet 15 stories up. When she'd finally made it downstairs, her ears ringing, her hands shaking, she'd found Mark standing in the garage entrance, staring at the burning wreckage of the car that should have killed him. The car he would have been in if she hadn't asked for Thai food, if she hadn't wanted extra spring rolls, if she hadn't kept him on the phone for 30 seconds longer than necessary. He'd turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she'd seen fear in his eyes. Not fear of death. Fear of what his life meant for hers. Carolina's hands trembled as she carried a tray of dirty dishes to the kitchen. She set them down too hard, the plates clattering against each other, one glass tipping over and rolling across the counter. "Careful," Miguel muttered, not looking up from his phone. She steadied herself against the sink, breathing slowly through her nose. They'd fought for 3 days after the explosion, not screaming fights, quiet, devastating conversations that peeled away the illusion they'd been living under. "I can protect you," Mark had insisted. "By doing what? Keeping me locked in a fortress? Surrounding me with armed men for the rest of my life, if that's what it takes?" "That's not living, Mark. That's surviving. There's a difference." He'd looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I can't lose you." "You already have," she'd whispered. "The moment that bomb went off, you lost me. Because now every time you leave, I'll wonder if you're coming back. Every time a car backfires, I'll flinch. Every stranger who looks at me too long will be a threat. That's not a life. That's a cage. Then what do you want?" She'd taken a breath that felt like drowning. "I want to disappear." And Mark, the man who controlled half the city, who could make people vanish with a phone call, who had built an empire on never backing down, had nodded once and said, "Okay, order up." The cook's voice jolted Carolina back to the present. She grabbed the plates and carried them to table 3, her face carefully neutral, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Across the restaurant, the 3 men in booth 7 were getting louder, more confident. One of them, the leader in the dark hoodie, caught her eye and smiled. Not a friendly smile. A promise. Carolina looked away and returned to her work. 3 years, she thought again. 3 years of staying invisible. Mark had kept his word. He'd funded her new life from a distance, never visiting, never calling, respecting the boundaries she'd drawn between them. But she'd always known deep in her bones, in the part of her that still belonged to him, that if she ever needed him, he would come. She just prayed tonight wouldn't be that night. The 3 men had names, though Carolina didn't know them yet. She would learn them later, when it was too late for the knowledge to matter. Diego Ruiz sat in the center of booth 7 like a king on a cardboard throne, 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if cruelty hadn't carved permanent lines around his mouth. He wore a dark hoodie despite the oppressive heat, because he liked the way it made him look dangerous, untouchable, like someone who mattered. In his world, he did matter. He ran collections for a local gang that controlled 3 blocks and thought that made them players. He'd broken fingers, burned cars, threatened families. He'd never killed anyone, but he told people he had. Most believed him. Power, Diego had learned, was 90% perception, and tonight, he perceived an opportunity. "She's scared of us," Antonio Vega said, grinning as he watched Carolina move between tables on the far side of the restaurant. He was smaller than Diego, wiry, with quick hands and quicker eyes. Everything was a joke to Antonio. Violence, consequences, other people's fear. He filmed everything on his phone, curating a digital gallery of humiliation that he shared with anyone who'd watch. She should be, Diego said, not looking away from Carolina. He'd been watching her all night, studying the way she moved, efficient, practiced, invisible, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her shoulders tensed whenever someone spoke too loudly. Weakness, he thought. She reeked of it. Maybe she doesn't speak English, Javier Mendez offered quietly. He was the youngest at 22, desperate to belong, to be seen as equal by men he'd only known for 3 months. Javier had grown up watching his father bow and scrape for men like Diego, had sworn he'd never be that weak, that submissive. He was becoming exactly what he feared. She speaks English, Diego said. She's just smart enough to keep her mouth shut around men. He smiled. I like that. Antonio laughed and raised his phone, filming Carolina as she delivered food to table 9. Think she's got a man? Does it matter? Diego's voice was flat, matter of fact. It didn't matter. It never mattered. Women like her, quiet, alone, working minimum wage in restaurants nobody cared about, were invisible for a reason. No one was coming to save them. No one was watching. No one would care if they disappeared for an hour into a back hallway and came out different than they went in. Diego had done this before. Not here, not exactly like this, but enough times to know the pattern, the isolation, the escalation, the moment when fear turned to compliance. He was patient. Professional, even. We should talk to her, Antonio said, still filming. Not yet, Diego replied. Let her get comfortable first. Let her think we're just regular customers. Carolina felt their attention like static electricity before a storm. She'd been working the floor for 2 hours since the incident with Antonio, and they hadn't left. Hadn't called for their check. Just sat there, ordering sodas they didn't drink, appetizers they didn't finish, occupying space like it was a tactical position. Jessica had tried taking their table twice. Both times, they'd waved her away and asked for Carolina specifically. They're creeping me out, Jessica whispered as they passed each other near the kitchen. She was 42, a single mother of 2, with tired eyes and hands that never stopped moving. You want me to get Miguel to kick them out? Carolina glanced at Miguel, who was scrolling through his phone behind the register, oblivious to anything beyond his screen. He won't, Carolina said quietly. Then what do? We wait for them to leave. But men like that didn't leave until they got what they came for. Diego watched the 2 waitresses whisper to each other and smiled. Fear was a language he spoke fluently. He could read it in body language, in the quick glances people threw over their shoulders, in the way they adjusted their routes to avoid proximity. Carolina was afraid. Good. Fear made people predictable. I'm bored, Antonio announced, setting his phone down. When are we doing this? Soon, Diego said. How soon? When the kitchen empties. Javier shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should just what? Diego turned to look at him, and Javier fell silent. You having second thoughts? No, because if you're not ready for this, you can wait in the car. Javier's jaw tightened. I'm ready. Then shut up and wait. The restaurant was starting to empty. The dinner rush had passed, leaving only a handful of stragglers, an elderly couple sharing flan, 2 construction workers arguing about a soccer game, a woman on her laptop nursing cold coffee. Diego checked his watch. 9:45. The kitchen would close at 10. Most of the staff would leave. The back hallway would be empty except for whoever was taking out trash or cleaning up. All he had to do was wait. Carolina cleared table 6 and felt the weight of their stares like hands on her skin. She'd been in dangerous situations before, had lived with danger, slept beside it, loved it despite knowing better, but this felt different. Uncontrolled. Random. Mark's world had rules. Codes. Lines that even monsters didn't cross. These men had no rules. She could see it in the way they looked at her, not as a person, but as an object, a thing to be used and discarded. She carried the dirty dishes toward the kitchen, her mind calculating distances, exits, possibilities. The front door was 30 feet away, but it was locked after 9, required a key from the inside. The back exit led to an alley, but it was through the hallway where they stored supplies, where the dumpsters sat, where no one would hear anything over the hum of the industrial refrigerators. She was trapped by geography and circumstance. Carolina, Miguel's voice made her jump. Can you take the trash out before you clock out? I gotta leave early tonight. She stared at him. Now? Yeah. It's overflowing. Just take it to the dumpster real quick. The back hallway. The alley. Alone. I'll do it, Jessica offered, appearing beside her. Nah, you got kids to pick up, Miguel said, already grabbing his keys. Carolina doesn't mind, right? Carolina looked at Jessica, then at booth 7, where 3 men sat watching her with expressions that made her blood run cold. Right, she heard herself say. Miguel disappeared into the office to grab his jacket. Jessica touched Carolina's arm. Want me to wait? No, Carolina said quietly. Go get your kids. Because whatever was about to happen, she didn't want witnesses, didn't want collateral damage, didn't want anyone else hurt because of her. Jessica hesitated, then nodded and headed for the exit. Across the restaurant, Diego Ruiz stood up. And Carolina knew her 3 years of invisibility were about to end. The kitchen was emptying faster than Carolina had hoped. The line cook, a 60-year-old man named Roberto, who chain-smoked on his breaks, wiped down the grill one last time and untied his grease-stained apron. You closing tonight? He asked, tossing the apron into the laundry bin. Just taking out the trash, Carolina replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Want me to wait? Yes, she thought. Stay. Don't leave me alone. I'm fine, she said instead. Roberto shrugged and headed for the back exit, the door slamming behind him with a metallic clang that echoed through the narrow hallway. The sound was final. Absolute. Carolina stood at the industrial sink, hands gripping the edge of the stainless steel counter, breathing slowly through her nose. The trash bag sat by the back door, bloated, heavy, leaking something dark onto the tile floor. She could leave it, clock out, walk through the front door while customers were still there, while witnesses still existed. But Miguel would complain, and she needed this job, needed the routine, needed the invisibility that had kept her safe for 3 years. Safe, she thought bitterly. The word had lost all meaning the moment those 3 men walked into the restaurant. Behind her, she heard the distinctive scrape of a chair being pushed back, footsteps on tile, multiple sets, moving with casual confidence toward the kitchen entrance. Carolina's hands tightened on the counter. She turned slowly. Diego appeared first in the kitchen doorway, backlit by the fluorescent lights of the dining room, his silhouette broad and deliberately imposing. He stood there for a moment, letting his presence fill the space, letting her understand that he controlled what happened next. Kitchen's closed, Carolina said, her voice flat. We're not hungry. Diego stepped inside, and Antonio followed. Then Javier, the 3 of them forming a loose semicircle that cut off her access to the dining room. The back door was 15 feet behind her, locked from the outside. She'd have to turn her back on them to open it, and they'd be on her before she got it halfway open. Restaurant's closing, she tried again. You need to pay your check. We will. Diego's smile was patient, almost gentle. Just wanted to talk to you first. You've been avoiding us all night. I've been working. That's what I mean. Working so hard, never stopping to chat. He took another step closer. Makes a man feel unwelcome. Carolina's mind raced through scenarios, calculating odds, measuring distances. 3 men, 1 exit behind her. No weapons within reach except kitchen knives that were locked in a drawer she couldn't get to without crossing their position. She was outmatched, outnumbered, alone, but she'd been in worse situations. She'd survived a car bomb, survived leaving the only man she'd ever loved, survived 3 years of reconstructing her identity from nothing. She would survive this. I need to take out the trash, she said calmly, moving toward the back door. Antonio shifted position, blocking her path without seeming to. We'll help. I don't need help. Sure you do. Diego's voice was still gentle, still reasonable. Heavy bag like that. Could hurt yourself. Carolina stopped moving, looked directly at Diego for the first time, meeting his eyes with an expression that held no fear, no pleading, no recognition of his power over her, just exhaustion. What do you want? She asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise him. Most women begged by now, or cried, or tried to bargain. Just to talk, Diego said. Get to know you. You seem lonely. I'm not. No boyfriend? No husband? Antonio grinned, filming with his phone again. Pretty girl like you should have somebody. Carolina's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The mention of a husband sent a flash of memory through her Mark's voice on the phone, calm and certain. No matter where you go, you won't be unprotected. But Mark didn't know where she was right now. Didn't know 3 men had cornered her in a restaurant kitchen while the city hummed obliviously outside. She was alone. Truly alone. "I need to take out the trash," she repeated. Diego's patience was thinning. She could see it in the way his smile tightened, in the subtle shift of his shoulders. "Then take it out." "We'll wait." It wasn't an offer. It was a command. Carolina lifted the trash bag, heavy, awkward, the plastic slick with grease, and moved toward the back door. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything except walk voluntarily into that dark hallway. But running would trigger the chase. Fighting would escalate the violence. She needed to stay calm, stay controlled, wait for an opening. The back door was heavy, industrial steel with a push bar that required force. Carolina shoved it open with her hip, the door swinging wide to reveal the narrow hallway beyond concrete walls, flickering overhead light, the smell of rotting food and stagnant water. She stepped through. Behind her, she heard Diego say, "Go with her." The hallway was worse than the kitchen. Narrower, darker. The single bulb overhead buzzed and flickered, casting unstable shadows across walls that were water-stained and covered in peeling paint. Antonio followed her first, still filming. Then Javier, looking increasingly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down now. Finally Diego, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. The dumpster sat at the end of the hallway, metal and rust-streaked, overflowing with garbage bags that had split open in the heat. The smell was overwhelming: rotting meat, spoiled milk, decomposition. Carolina walked toward it, her mind hyper-aware of everything. The distance to the alley exit, 20 feet. The position of each man behind her. Antonio closest, Javier to the left. Diego hanging back, the texture of the trash bag in her hands, slick, heavy, could be used as a weapon if she swung hard enough. She reached the dumpster and lifted the bag to throw it inside. A hand grabbed her wrist. Antonio, grinning, phone still raised. Not so fast. Carolina's other hand was still free, still holding the trash bag. She could swing it, catch him in the face. Buy herself maybe 5 seconds. But then what? "Let go," she said quietly. "Make me." The overhead light flickered again, casting the hallway into brief darkness. When it came back on, Diego was directly behind her, and Javier had moved to block the exit. "See," Diego said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "This is what happens when pretty girls work alone. Bad things. Dangerous things." His hand settled on her shoulder, not violent yet, just present, establishing ownership. "Nobody knows you're here," he continued. "Nobody's coming to save you. So you can make this easy, or you can make this hard. But either way." Carolina drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus with every ounce of strength she possessed. Diego stumbled backward, the air knocked from his lungs, his hands clutching his chest. For 3 seconds, the hallway hung in suspended animation, Antonio's grin faltering, Javier frozen by the exit, Carolina breathing hard with the trash bag still gripped in her left hand. Then Diego's face twisted with rage. "You stupid." He lunged forward and slammed her against the concrete wall. Carolina's head cracked against the surface, stars exploding behind her eyes. The trash bag fell from her grip, splitting open, garbage spilling across the floor. "Grab her arms," Diego snarled. Antonio dropped his phone into his pocket and seized her left wrist, twisting it behind her back. Javier hesitated for only a moment before taking the other, pinning her completely. Diego's hand wrapped around her throat, not squeezing hard enough to kill, just enough to make breathing difficult, just enough to remind her who controlled the oxygen. "Think you're tough?" His face was inches from hers, spit flecking her cheek. "Think you can fight back?" Carolina didn't struggle, didn't beg. She'd learned years ago that panic fed men like this, that fear was fuel for their power. Instead, she did something that unnerved them more than screaming would have. She looked directly into Diego's eyes with perfect, devastating calm, like she was memorizing his face, like she was counting the seconds until something inevitable arrived, like she knew something he didn't. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Diego demanded, his grip tightening slightly. Carolina's lips moved, barely a whisper. "You should have left." "What?" "When you had the chance, you should have left." Diego laughed, but it sounded forced. "Nobody's coming for you, sweetheart. You're alone." Behind them, from somewhere deeper in the building, came the sound of a door opening. Not the kitchen door, not the alley exit, the front entrance. Heavy footsteps on tile, deliberate, unhurried, moving through the empty restaurant with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Antonio's grip on her wrist loosened slightly. "Diego." "Shut up!" But Diego had heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the kitchen entrance, calculating. Probably just the owner coming back for something, or a late customer who hadn't read the close sign. The footsteps continued. Through the dining room, past booth 7, approaching the kitchen with mechanical inevitability. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps had been. Javier released Carolina's arm and took a step backward. "Maybe we should—" The kitchen door swung open. Mark Rojas stood in the doorway, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. He wore a black suit, no tie, the shirt open at the collar revealing the bottom edge of tattoos that crept up his neck, designs that told stories in ink, territorial marks, symbols of allegiance and power that only certain people knew how to read. His dark hair was cut short, professional, the kind of style that could pass in boardrooms or back alleys with equal ease. But it was his face that made Antonio's hands go slack, made Javier press himself against the wall like he could disappear into the concrete. Mark Rojas wasn't angry. That would have been easier to process, easier to react to. He was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. His dark eyes swept the scene with clinical precision. Carolina pinned against the wall, hand still around her throat, garbage scattered across the floor. 3 men who had made a mistake they didn't yet understand the magnitude of. He looked at each of them in turn, studying faces he would remember forever. Then his gaze settled on Diego's hand, still wrapped around Carolina's neck. "Take your hands off my wife," Mark said quietly. His voice was conversational, pleasant, even. Like he was asking someone to pass the salt. Diego's hand didn't move. His brain was still processing the words, trying to reconcile the terrified waitress he'd been choking with the word wife, trying to place the man in the doorway who looked familiar in a way that made his stomach drop. Diego started. Mark took 1 step forward. It was just a step. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, but the promise of violence in that single movement made Diego release Carolina's throat and stumble backward, his hands raising defensively. "We didn't know," Antonio said quickly, his voice pitching higher. "Man, we were just what?" Mark's tone remained conversational, curious even, like he genuinely wanted to understand their reasoning. "Just putting your hands on a woman who told you no? Just cornering her in a dark hallway? Just touching my wife?" He said the last 2 words with a razor-thin edge that made Javier whimper. Carolina slid down the wall, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She sat on the filthy floor among the scattered garbage, one hand touching her throat where Diego's fingers had been, the other pressed against the concrete to steady herself. Mark's eyes flicked to her just for a second, just long enough to assess if she was seriously hurt before returning to the 3 men. "I'm going to ask you a question," Mark said, still in that terrifyingly calm voice. "And I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Do you know who I am?" Silence. Then recognition dawned on Diego's face like a slow-motion car crash. He'd seen this man before, not in person, but in photographs passed around, whispered about, used as cautionary tales. Mark Rojas, the name that made grown men check over their shoulders. The man who controlled territories Diego's entire gang couldn't touch. "Oh God," Diego breathed. "That's not an answer," Mark said, "but I'll take it as a yes." He moved forward again, and this time Diego scrambled backward so fast he tripped over a garbage bag and hit the ground hard, his hands raised in surrender. "Please, I swear we didn't know." "Obviously." Mark stopped 3 feet away from them, close enough that they could see the tattoos disappearing beneath his collar, close enough that they could smell his cologne, expensive, controlled, completely at odds with the violence radiating from his posture. "Because if you'd known, you would have left the city the moment you saw her face." Antonio tried to run. He made it 4 steps before Mark's hand shot out and grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him backward with casual strength. Antonio's feet went out from under him and he crashed into the wall, the impact driving the air from his lungs. "Nobody moves," Mark said pleasantly. "Nobody runs. Nobody speaks unless I ask a direct question. Are we clear?" 3 heads nodded frantically. Mark glanced back at Carolina, his expression softening for just a moment. "Are you hurt?" Carolina shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Did they?" He couldn't finish the question. "No," she managed. "You got here first." Something in his posture relaxed infinitesimally. Then his attention returned to the 3 men, and the monster came back. "Good," Mark said softly. "That means I only have to break them, not kill them." Mark Rojas moved like violence was a language he'd been speaking since birth. Fluid, economical, precise. There was no wasted motion, No theatrical flourish, just brutal efficiency. Diego tried to stand, hands still raised in surrender. Listen, we can. Mark's fist connected with his jaw before he finished the sentence. The sound was sickening, bone against bone, the wet crack of impact. Diego's head snapped sideways and he went down hard, blood already streaming from his mouth. He tried to scramble backward, but Mark followed, grabbed a fistful of his hoodie, and drove him face first into the concrete wall. The paint cracked. A chunk of plaster fell to the floor. Diego slumped, semi-conscious, making sounds that weren't quite words. Antonio bolted for the alley exit. He made it 6 feet before Mark caught him by the collar and used his own momentum to swing him around. Antonio's back slammed into the industrial shelving unit that lined the hallway, metal rattling, boxes of supplies tumbling to the floor. I said nobody runs, Mark said calmly. He drove his knee into Antonio's stomach with surgical precision. Antonio doubled over, vomiting onto the floor, his phone clattering from his pocket and landing in the puddle of his own sick. Mark picked up the phone with 2 fingers, looked at the screen, saw the video still recording, and crushed it beneath his heel. Glass and circuits crunched like insects. You were filming, Mark observed. That's evidence. Bad for your health. Antonio tried to speak but could only gag. Mark released him and let him slide down the shelving unit to sit in his own vomit, gasping for air. Throughout it all, Carolina remained on the floor, watching with an expression that held no satisfaction, no vindication, just exhaustion. She'd seen Mark fight before, had seen what he was capable of when someone threatened what was his. It had terrified her then. Now it just made her sad. This was why she'd left. Not because Mark was violent, but because his violence followed him like a shadow, touching everyone who came near. These 3 men were stupid, cruel, dangerous. They deserved consequences. But watching Mark deliver those consequences reminded her of the fundamental truth she'd been running from for 3 years. Loving Mark Rojas meant living in proximity to brutality, no matter how far she ran, because he would always find her, always protect her, always become a monster for her sake. Javier hadn't moved. He stood pressed against the wall near the exit, tears streaming down his face, his whole body trembling. He was the youngest, the one who'd joined Diego because he'd been tired of being weak, tired of watching his father bow to men like this. Now he understood. Power wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage. Mark turned to face him, and Javier's bladder nearly gave out. How old are you? Mark asked conversationally. 22. Javier's voice broke. You touch her? I held her arm. That's all. I swear that's all. Mark studied him for a long moment. You held her arm, while your friend put his hand around her throat, while she was pinned against a wall, while she was terrified. I'm sorry. Javier was openly sobbing now. Please, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. No, Mark agreed. You didn't know. But ignorance isn't innocence. You think I didn't know makes it better? You think she cares that you didn't know who her husband was when you held her down? Javier couldn't answer. Mark stepped closer, and Javier flinched so hard he nearly fell. But Mark didn't hit him. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I'm going to give you a gift, Mark said. I'm going to let you walk away. Not because you deserve mercy, but because she does. He gestured toward Carolina without looking away from Javier. She's already seen too much violence tonight, so you get to leave. But understand something. He grabbed Javier's face, forcing eye contact. If I ever see you again, if I hear your name, if you're in the same city as her, if you so much as breathe in her direction, I will find you. And what I did to them, he nodded toward Diego and Antonio, will look like kindness. Do you understand? Javier nodded frantically, tears and snot running down his face. Mark released him. Then leave. Javier ran. His footsteps echoed through the hallway, through the kitchen, through the restaurant. The front door slammed. Diego groaned and tried to sit up, blood still pouring from his nose and mouth. Mark watched him dispassionately, like an exterminator observing an insect that refused to die. You broke my nose, Diego slurred. Yes, Mark agreed. You can't just, there are laws. Mark crouched down to eye level. You're right, there are laws, and according to those laws, you just committed attempted sexual assault. You cornered a woman in a dark hallway, put your hands on her throat, held her against her will. He tilted his head slightly, considering, the police will be here in approximately 4 minutes. I called them before I came inside. They'll find you here with injuries that you'll claim I inflicted. And I'll explain that I arrived to pick up my wife, and found you attacking her. That I defended her using reasonable force." Diego's eyes widened. "That's not you beat us." "Did I?" Mark's voice was mild. "Because I remember arriving, telling you to remove your hands from my wife, and then defending her when you became aggressive. Any injuries you sustained were the result of your own actions. Self-defense is legal in this state." He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "The security camera at the front of the restaurant has been recording this entire time. It shows 3 men entering, shows them sitting in a booth for hours, shows them following my wife into the back hallway, shows me entering afterward." Mark smiled without warmth. "Tell me, Diego, who do you think the police will believe? 3 gang members with prior records? Or a respected businessman who called 911 the moment he saw his wife in danger?" Diego's face went pale. "That's what I thought." Mark finally turned to Carolina, and his entire demeanor shifted. The monster evaporated, replaced by something gentler, more human. He crossed the hallway and knelt beside her, careful not to touch her without permission. "Are you hurt?" His voice was soft now, concerned. Carolina shook her head. Her throat felt bruised where Diego had grabbed her, and her head still throbbed from hitting the wall. But nothing was broken. "Did they?" He still couldn't finish that question. "No," she said quietly. "You got here in time." Relief flooded his face. For just a moment, he looked like the man she'd fallen in love with before the Empire, before the violence, before everything became complicated. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." "How did you know?" "I always know." His hand hovered near her face, not quite touching. "I told you. No matter where you go, you're never unprotected." In the distance, sirens wailed. The sirens grew louder, converging on El Rosario from multiple directions. Red and blue lights began to strobe through the grimy windows, painting the hallway in alternating colors that made the scene look even more nightmarish than it already was. Mark stood smoothly and extended his hand to Carolina. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it, letting him pull her to her feet. His hand was warm, familiar, steady. For 3 years she'd denied herself this simple comfort, his presence, his touch, the certainty that came from knowing someone would always catch her when she fell. Now, standing in a hallway that smelled of garbage and blood, that denial felt absurd. "The police will want your statement," Mark said, his tone shifting to something professional, almost businesslike. "Tell them exactly what happened. Don't leave anything out. Don't protect them." Carolina nodded, brushing dirt and garbage from her apron with shaking hands. Behind them, Diego had managed to prop himself against the wall, one hand pressed to his bleeding nose. Antonio was still curled on the floor, breathing in ragged gasps. Both men watched Mark with expressions of pure terror, not the theatrical fear they'd tried to inspire in Carolina, but genuine primal understanding of their own mortality. They'd cornered a woman they thought was powerless. They'd touched the wife of a man who could make them disappear with a phone call. The door to the kitchen burst open and 2 uniformed officers entered, hands on their weapons, assessing the scene with trained efficiency. "Hands where we can see them," the first officer shouted. Mark raised his hands slowly, calmly, no sudden movements. "I'm the one who called. My name is Mark Rojas. That's my wife, Carolina. These men attacked her." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, took in the scene Carolina's disheveled appearance, the bruises already forming on her neck, the 2 men on the floor, Mark's impeccable suit showing not a single tear. "Sir, step away from the woman," she ordered. "She's my wife," Mark repeated patiently. "Step away anyway." Mark complied, moving backward with his hands still raised. The female officer approached Carolina while her partner kept his weapon trained on Diego and Antonio. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Carolina touched her throat unconsciously. I'm okay. They grabbed me, but who grabbed you?" Carolina pointed at Diego and Antonio. "Those 2. The third one ran. They cornered me in the hallway. One of them put his hand around my neck, the other twisted my arm behind my back." The officer's expression hardened. "And him?" She nodded toward Mark. "He saved me," Carolina said quietly. "He got here before they could—" Her voice cracked. "Before they could do worse." More officers arrived. The hallway became crowded with uniforms, radios crackling, cameras flashing to document the scene. An EMT appeared and tried to examine Carolina, but she waved them toward Diego, whose nose was clearly broken. "Check him first," she said. The EMT looked uncertain but complied. Mark stood against the far wall, perfectly still, perfectly controlled, answering questions with practiced ease. Yes, he'd received a call from a friend who'd seen suspicious activity at the restaurant. No, he hadn't known his wife was in danger until he arrived. Yes, he'd used force to stop the assault, exactly as much force as necessary and no more. His story was airtight, reasonable, backed by security footage that would show exactly what he wanted it to show. Carolina watched him work, watched him manipulate reality with the same precision he used to run his empire, and felt something twist inside her chest. This was Mark in his element, controlled, calculating, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. The detective who arrived 20 minutes later was older, cynical, with the kind of face that had seen every lie humanity had to offer. He separated Carolina and Mark, conducting interviews in different rooms. Carolina in the restaurant's small office, Mark in the kitchen. "Tell me what happened tonight," the detective said, his recorder running. "Start from the beginning." So Carolina did. She told him about the 3 men watching her all night, about Antonio grabbing her wrist earlier in the evening, about being asked to take out the trash, about the hallway, the assault, Diego's hand around her throat. "And your husband just happened to arrive at exactly the right moment?" The detective's tone was neutral, but the implication was clear. "He comes by sometimes," Carolina said, "to check on me. I didn't know he was coming tonight." "Where have you been for the past 3 years, Mrs. Rojas?" The question surprised her. "Working here, living my life, separately from your husband." "Yes." "That's unusual. For a married couple," Carolina met his eyes steadily. "We had our reasons. Did those reasons involve your husband's business dealings?" "I don't know anything about my husband's business." It wasn't quite a lie. She knew what Mark did, had known for years, but she deliberately kept herself separate from the details, the transactions, the network of loyalty and violence that sustained his empire. The detective studied her for a long moment. 3 men attacked you. Your husband severely injured 2 of them. That's self-defense under California law, defense of another person. But I need to know if there's more to this story. If this was about something other than an assault. Like what? Like retaliation, territory, a message being sent. Carolina shook her head. "Those men didn't know who I was. They thought I was just a waitress. They made a mistake. A fatal one, nearly." "Yes," Carolina agreed quietly. "But not in the way you think. They're alive. They'll face charges. That's more mercy than they showed me." The detective sighed and clicked off his recorder. "You're free to go, Mrs. Rojas. We'll need you to come in tomorrow to sign your statement." Diego and Antonio were taken away in separate ambulances, both in custody, both facing charges of assault and attempted sexual assault. Officers had already identified Javier from security footage and issued a warrant for his arrest. The restaurant was a crime scene now. Yellow tape across the doors, evidence markers scattered across the hallway floor. Carolina stood outside, wrapped in a blanket an EMT had insisted she take despite the warm night air. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Mark emerged from the restaurant, escorted by 2 officers who looked uncomfortable in his presence. They released him at the tape line with nods that were almost respectful. He walked to where Carolina stood and stopped 3 feet away, maintaining distance, respecting the boundary she'd drawn 3 years ago. "I need to leave," he said quietly. "Before reporters arrive. Before this becomes more complicated." Carolina nodded. She understood. Mark's world operated in shadows, and this police lights, official statements, public records, was far too exposed. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For keeping your promise." Mark's expression softened. "Always." He hesitated, then added, "Are you going back to your apartment tonight?" "I don't know. It's not safe. Not yet. They were locals, but they have friends, family, people who might not understand what happened here." Carolina's hands tightened on the blanket. She'd built a life on independence, on not needing protection, on being invisible. That life had just been burned to the ground. "Where should I go?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Mark pulled a key from his pocket and held it out. "The penthouse. It's still yours. It's always been yours." Carolina stared at the key silver, simple, attached to a keychain she'd given him 7 years ago. He'd kept it. "All this time. I won't be there," Mark added quickly. "I have an apartment across town. You'll have complete privacy, but you'll be safe, protected." She took the key, their fingers brushing for just a moment. "This doesn't mean," she started. "I know," Mark interrupted gently. "This doesn't mean anything except you need somewhere safe to sleep tonight." That's all. But they both knew it meant more than that. The wall she'd built between them had cracked the moment he walked into that hallway, and neither of them knew how to rebuild it. Carolina didn't go to the penthouse that night. Instead, she went back to her tiny studio apartment, 3 blocks from the restaurant, a 4th-floor walk-up with water-stained walls and a radiator that clanked like chains dragging across metal. She'd lived there for 3 years, surrounded by thrift store furniture and silence, convincing herself this was freedom. Now it just felt empty. She sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her stained apron, Mark's key resting on her palm like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television, someone's argument in Spanish, the constant background noise of a building where privacy was an illusion. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Security is outside your building. Don't be alarmed. They won't approach unless you're in danger." Carolina walked to the window and looked down at the street. A black sedan sat parked across from her building, engine off, 2 silhouettes visible in the front seats. She should have been angry, should have resented the intrusion, the assumption that she needed protection, the reminder that Mark's world was seeping back into hers whether she wanted it or not. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. Sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Diego's hand around her throat, felt the concrete wall against her skull, heard Antonio's laugh echoing through the hallway. But worse than the memory of the assault was the memory of what came after Mark's face when he'd seen her pinned against that wall. The cold precision of his violence, the way he dismantled 3 men without breaking a sweat, then knelt beside her with infinite gentleness. He was still both men. The monster and the protector. The man who broke bones and the man who remembered her mother's birthday. She'd left because she couldn't live with that contradiction, but tonight, that contradiction had saved her life. At 4 a.m, Carolina gave up on sleep. She showered, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, washing away the smell of garbage and fear and blood. She stood under the water until it ran cold, then dressed in clean clothes and sat at her small kitchen table with coffee she couldn't taste. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Jessica. "Are you okay? Police came to my house. Heard what happened. I'm so sorry I left you alone." Carolina typed back. "Not your fault. I'm fine." Another buzz. "Miguel this time. Restaurant's closed for investigation. Don't know when it opens. I'll let you know about your shifts." And another. From a number she didn't recognize. "This is Detective Morrison. Need you to come to the station today to sign your statement. Any time after 9 a.m. Reality was reassembling itself around her, demanding responses, requiring her to function when all she wanted was to disappear. At 7:30, Carolina grabbed her jacket and walked downstairs. The black sedan was still there, the 2 men inside alert but unobtrusive. They didn't approach her, didn't speak, just watched as she walked past and headed toward the bus stop. She didn't take the bus. Instead, she walked the 12 blocks to the police station, letting the morning air clear her head, letting the rhythm of her footsteps steady her thoughts. The city was waking up, shops opening, commuters rushing past, the smell of coffee and exhaust mixing in the cool air. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 2 blocks away, a woman had nearly been destroyed in a restaurant hallway. The world kept turning. It always did. The police station was exactly as depressing as Carolina expected. Fluorescent lights, scuffed floors, the smell of bad coffee and institutional despair. Detective Morrison met her in the lobby, his expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Rojas, thank you for coming in." He led her to a small interview room and presented her with a typed statement, her words from last night, organized into formal legal language that made the assault sound clinical, distant. Carolina read it twice, signed it, and slid it back across the table. "The 2 men are being held on $50,000 bail each," Morrison said. "The third, Javier Mendez, turned himself in this morning. His lawyer is already working on a plea deal." "What about charges?" "Assault, attempted sexual assault, unlawful restraint. With your testimony and the security footage, the DA thinks they can get convictions. You'll likely have to testify at trial." Carolina nodded slowly. Trial meant months of her life connected to this night. Meant reliving it in front of strangers. Meant Diego and Antonio staring at her from across a courtroom. "Your husband won't be charged," Morrison added. "Self-defense is clear-cut here. But I need to ask, do you feel safe returning to your normal life?" "I don't know what my normal life is anymore." Morrison studied her with something that might have been sympathy. These men weren't connected to any major organizations. They're street-level thugs, but they have friends, family, People who might blame you for what happened. Blame me? For being connected to who you're connected to. He leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Rojas, I've been doing this for 23 years. I know who your husband is. I know what he controls. And I know that what happened last night isn't just an assault case, it's a message. To everyone in this city who thinks they can touch what's his. Carolina's jaw tightened. I'm not a possession. I didn't say you were. But perception matters. And right now, every small-time criminal in the city knows that touching you means war with Mark Rojas. That's protection. But it's also a target. He slid a business card across the table. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me directly. I can't promise I can help, but I can promise I'll try. Carolina took the card and stood. Is that all? One more thing. Morrison's expression shifted, became almost gentle. Whatever complicated history you have with your husband, however you got to where you are tonight, proved something. He loves you, in his own way. Men like that don't risk exposure for just anyone. Carolina didn't respond. She couldn't, because Morrison was right, and that terrified her more than Diego's hands ever had. Outside the police station, Carolina stood on the sidewalk and stared at the key Mark had given her. The penthouse. Safety. Protection. Everything she'd walked away from 3 years ago. Or her apartment. Independence. The life she'd built alone. She thought about the black sedan following her this morning. About Morrison's warning. About the fact that invisibility, her only defense for 3 years, had been shattered in a single night. She thought about Mark kneeling beside her in that hallway, his voice soft with concern, his hands careful not to touch without permission. Carolina pulled out her phone and typed, "I'll take you up on the penthouse, just for a few days, until this settles." The response came within seconds. "It's yours as long as you need it. Code is your birthday." She stared at the message. He'd kept the code as her birthday. For 3 years. Even though she'd never used it, even though she'd left. Carolina hailed a cab and gave the driver an address she'd sworn she'd never return to. The penthouse looked exactly as Carolina remembered, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, hardwood floors that gleamed in the morning light, furniture that managed to be both expensive and comfortable. But there were differences too. Small ones that made her chest tighten. Fresh flowers in the vase on the kitchen counter, her favorite coffee in the cabinet, the photograph of them at her cousin's wedding the night they'd met, still sitting on the bookshelf in a silver frame. Mark had kept her here. In small ways, in the details that most people wouldn't notice. He'd let her leave but had never let her go. Carolina set her bag down and walked to the windows. The city spread out below like a map of possibility, buildings and streets, and lives intersecting in patterns that seemed random but weren't. Everything was connected. Everyone touched everyone else in ways they didn't realize. She'd tried to extract herself from that web, had convinced herself she could exist separately, independently, untouched by the violence that defined Mark's world. Last night had proven how naive that belief was. Her phone buzzed. "Jessica again. Can we meet? Need to talk to you." They agreed on a coffee shop in neutral territory halfway between the restaurant and Carolina's old apartment. A place neither of them had history with. Jessica was already there when Carolina arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of exhausted expression that came from sleepless nights and too many worries. "I'm sorry," Jessica said before Carolina even sat down. "I'm so sorry I left you alone. It wasn't your fault. I knew they were watching you. I should have stayed. Should have called the police. Should have done something." Carolina reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You have 2 kids who needed to be picked up. You did what you had to do. What happened isn't on you." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Miguel called me this morning. Said the restaurant might not reopen. Said the owner's considering selling. Something about bad publicity and legal liability." Carolina felt the floor drop out from under her. "The restaurant's closing?" "I don't know. Maybe. Miguel said the owner's been getting calls. Threats, maybe? I don't know the details. But everything's different now. Different. That was one way to describe it." Carolina had built her new life on routine, the same shifts, the same tables, the same carefully constructed invisibility. Now that routine was gone. The restaurant might close. Her anonymity was destroyed. And everyone in the city knew exactly who she was. "What are you going to do?" Jessica asked quietly. "I don't know. Are you—" Jessica hesitated. "Are you going back to your husband?" The question hung between them. "I don't know," Carolina repeated. But that wasn't quite true. She did know. She'd known the moment she'd taken Mark's key, known the moment she'd walked into this penthouse and seen the flowers and the photograph and all the evidence that he'd been waiting for her to come home. She just didn't know if she could admit it yet. Carolina spent the afternoon alone, wandering through the penthouse like a ghost haunting her own past. She found clothes in the closet, her clothes carefully preserved, organized by color and season, found books on the shelves she'd read years ago, the spines still creased where she'd folded the pages, found a drawer in the bathroom with her makeup, her perfume, everything exactly where she'd left it. Mark had turned this place into a museum of their life together, a shrine to something he'd never stopped hoping could be resurrected. At 6 o'clock, Carolina stood at the windows and watched the sun set over the city. The sky burned orange and red, reflecting off glass towers, painting everything in shades of fire. Her phone rang. Mark. She almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail. But her finger pressed the button before her brain could intervene. Hello. Did you get in okay? His voice was carefully neutral, professional, almost. Yes, thank you. A pause. Then, I meant what I said. I won't come by. You have complete privacy. The security team has instructions to stay outside unless you call for help. I know. Another pause. Longer this time. Carolina could hear him breathing on the other end. Could imagine him standing somewhere in his other apartment, the one she'd never seen, the one he'd gotten after she'd left, trying to figure out what to say to a wife who wasn't quite his wife anymore. Carolina, he said finally. What happened last night? I know. No, listen. I need to say this. He took a breath. I promised I'd keep you safe. I promised I'd stay away. And I kept both promises, until I couldn't anymore. I'm not sorry I came, but I'm sorry you were in that position to begin with. I'm sorry my life, my world followed you even when I didn't. Carolina's throat tightened. It wasn't your fault, wasn't it? You left because you didn't want to be a target. And 3 years later, 3 random thugs nearly, his voice broke. Actually broke. They nearly destroyed you because I couldn't protect you from distance. You did protect me. Barely. I got there barely in time. Carolina pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city glittered with artificial light, millions of people living millions of lives, most of them blissfully unaware of the violence that hummed beneath the surface. I don't know what happens now, she said quietly. Nothing has to happen. You can stay there as long as you need. You can leave whenever you want. I won't push. I won't demand. I'll just... He stopped. I'll just be grateful you're alive. They stayed on the phone in silence for a moment, not awkward silence, but the comfortable kind that came from years of knowing someone so deeply that words became optional. Mark? Yeah? Did you really keep everything? My clothes, my books, everything? A pause. Then, almost sheepishly, yes. Why? Because I'm an idiot who can't let go of things that matter. Despite everything, the trauma, the fear, the exhaustion. Carolina smiled. Get some rest, Mark said softly. I'll check in tomorrow. He hung up before she could respond. Carolina stood at the window until the sky went dark and the city became a constellation of lights below. That night, she slept in the bed she'd shared with Mark for 4 years. The sheets were fresh. He must have had someone change them before she arrived, but the mattress still felt the same. The view from the window still looked the same. Only she was different. She'd left this place a woman who believed distance could equal safety. She'd come back knowing that safety was an illusion, that the world was dangerous whether you faced it or hid from it, that sometimes the monster in your life was also the only thing standing between you and worse monsters. Carolina fell asleep thinking about Diego's hand around her throat, and woke up thinking about Mark's hand reaching out to pull her to her feet. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in shades of gold. Carolina woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. The penthouse, her old life, the place she'd sworn she'd never return to. Yet here she was. She made coffee in the pristine kitchen, using the expensive machine that remembered her preferences, and stood at the counter watching the city wake up below. People rushing to work, cars streaming through intersections, life continuing with relentless momentum, indifferent to individual trauma. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Miguel and a voicemail. Carolina, it's official. Owner selling. Restaurant closes end of the month. I'm really sorry. I'll have your final check ready by Friday. 3 years of careful routine gone. Just like that. Carolina should have felt panic. Should have immediately started searching for new jobs, updating her resume, figuring out how to pay rent on an apartment she no longer felt safe in. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to relief. The restaurant had been a hiding place, a way to prove to herself she could survive without Mark, without protection, without the complicated safety his world provided. She'd proven it. For 3 years, she'd been invisible, independent, alone, and it had nearly gotten her killed. At noon, Carolina received a text from an unknown number. Detective Morrison. Thought you should know Diego Ruiz made bail this morning. Posting officer noted he made threats. Not specific, but concerning. Stay vigilant. Her hands tightened on the phone. Diego was out, angry, humiliated, probably blaming her for his broken nose and the assault charges that would follow him forever. Before she could process that information, her phone rang. "Mark, did you get Morrison's text?" he asked without preamble. "How did you—" "I have people at the station. Diego made bail at 9 this morning. He's being monitored." "By the police?" "By me." Carolina closed her eyes. "Mark, he threatened you, Carolina. In front of witnesses. He's out on bail for assaulting you, and his first instinct is to make more threats. You think I'm going to leave that to chance? You can't just have people followed." "I can and I will. You can be angry about it later. Right now, you're going to let me keep you safe." The certainty in his voice should have made her furious. Should have triggered all the reasons she'd left the control. The assumption that his way was the only way. The fact that loving Mark meant accepting that he would always choose her safety over her agency, but she was too tired to fight. "Okay," she said quietly. Silence on the other end. Then, "Okay, just for now. Until this is resolved. Then we'll talk about boundaries. We can talk about whatever you want, as long as you're alive to have the conversation." The rest of the day passed in strange suspension, Carolina existing in a life that felt both familiar and foreign. She avoided the news, avoided social media, avoided anything that might show her the story spreading through the city. Woman attacked, Mafia boss's wife, violence at El Rosario. Her privacy was gone, her anonymity destroyed. Everyone would know who she was now, where she'd been, who she'd been hiding from. At 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the penthouse door. Carolina froze. Mark had promised he wouldn't come by. Security was supposed to stay outside. She checked the peephole and saw Jessica standing in the hallway, looking nervous and out of place in the expensive building. Carolina opened the door. "How did you get up here?" "Told the doorman I was your sister. He called up, and when no one answered, I said you were expecting me, and showed him texts." Jessica held up her phone sheepishly. "I'm sorry. I needed to see if you were okay. Your apartment was empty and I got worried." Carolina stepped aside and let her in. Jessica's eyes went wide as she took in the penthouse, the view, the furniture, the obvious wealth. "This is where you've been staying? It's complicated, I'll say." Jessica turned to face her. "Carolina, who are you?" It was the question everyone would be asking now. The question Carolina had been avoiding for 3 years. "I'm exactly who you think I am," Carolina said quietly. "A waitress who wanted a normal life, who wanted to be invisible, who thought distance could keep me safe. And your husband is exactly who you've heard he is. Powerful, dangerous, someone you don't cross." Jessica sat down on the couch, looking overwhelmed. "I worked with you for 2 years. We talked about our lives. You never mentioned, I know. I'm sorry. The lies weren't about you. They were about survival." "Survival from what? From him?" "No." Carolina shook her head firmly. "Never from him. From his world. From being a target. From being the one thing that could be used against him." Jessica absorbed this. "But you're back now. In his world." "I don't know what I am," Carolina admitted. "I just know that 3 men almost destroyed me because I thought I could exist outside his protection. And maybe that was naive. Or maybe," Jessica said carefully, "loving someone dangerous means accepting that the danger never really leaves. It just changes shape." Carolina had no response to that, because Jessica was right. After Jessica left, Carolina stood at the windows and watched night fall over the city. Somewhere out there, Diego was free on bail, probably planning revenge. Somewhere out there, Mark was tracking his every move, deploying resources, ensuring threats were neutralized before they materialized. This was the pattern they'd always been trapped in, Carolina wanting freedom, Mark providing safety, the two needs constantly at war with each other. But tonight, Carolina realized something she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Freedom without safety wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage. She pulled out her phone and typed, "Can we talk? Not about last night. About everything." Mark's response came immediately. "Tomorrow? Lunch? Neutral location? The park where you proposed? Noon. I'll be there." Carolina set down her phone and looked at her reflection in the dark window. She looked tired, older than her 30 years, but also more certain than she'd been in a long time. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Didn't know if she and Mark could find a way back to each other that didn't require her to sacrifice who she was or him to stop being who he was. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Invisibility hadn't saved her. Mark had. And 3 years of running had taught her that some connections couldn't be broken, no matter how far you ran or how hard you tried. Some promises were kept whether you wanted them to be or not. Outside, the city hummed with life, dangerous, beautiful, indifferent. And Carolina Rojas, no longer invisible, no longer running, prepared to face whatever came next. Not alone, not as a victim, but as a woman who had survived the worst and was still standing. They had picked the wrong girl, and tomorrow, she would figure out what came after that. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.